can vote in the U.S.? Well, these days, virtually all adult citizens can vote in federal elections. But this was not always the case. When the Constitution was ratified, only about half of free white men could vote. So we're really limiting that category. You had to be free, you had to be white, and you had to be a man, and you also had to be an adult. And still, even with all those limitations, only about half would still meet the qualifications to vote. Now, those restrictions were lifted very quickly so that if you were a free adult white man, you pretty much could vote by the middle of the 1800s. Now, after that still excludes large swaths of the population, right? So after the Civil War, black people got the right to vote. And that was constitutionally protected by the Civil War amendments. However, we saw that this did not extend the vote to all black people. First of all, it did not extend the vote to any black women because women of any race still were not allowed to vote. But even just amongst black men, there were still quite a few limitations on voting that made it very difficult for black men to exercise their new right to vote. These laws were primarily in the South, though not exclusively, and were mostly implemented after the end of Reconstruction. And what these laws did were implement things like poll taxes or literacy tests, which made it very difficult to vote. And technically, these made it difficult to vote for anyone, right? There were poor and illiterate white people, too. And the literacy tests were so difficult that even most literate people could not pass them. So how then did they just prevent black people from voting? Well, because they had these things called grandfather clauses. Grandfather clauses said, if your grandfather could vote, then you don't have to pay this tax or take this test. But of course, in the South, in the years immediately following the Civil War, black people's grandfathers couldn't vote. But white people's grandfathers could have voted. So what we have is a law that technically is not about race, but very clearly only excludes one race from access to the polls. So what happens then is that these laws stay in effect really till the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act, which greatly expanded suffrage and eliminated these various different laws that prevented black people from voting. Now, I skipped over 1920. In 1920, women got the right to vote. This was women of all race were allowed to vote, though, of course, those discriminatory laws did make it much harder for black women to vote than white women. Finally, we have one other large expansion of voting rights. That was in 1971, when the voting age was lowered from 21 down to 18. And that was done primarily because there were a lot of young people who were really unhappy with the Vietnam War and were like, wait, I'm dying for my country, but I'm not allowed to vote for my president? Like, I could be drafted in the military, but not vote for the commander-in-chief? Huh? So politicians kind of thought, hey, if we let them in, maybe they'll, vote for us. This was sort of the motive of a lot of anti-war Democrats to lower the voting age. Ultimately, though, this didn't really help Democrats or Republicans. This didn't really help anyone because the vast majority of 18 to 21-year-olds did not immediately take that right. So even though they were allowed to vote, many of them still did not, and all we really saw was voting turnout as a percentage of the people who were eligible plummeted in the aftermath of that. Today, though, we do see younger people voting more and more frequently, but still typically at lower rates than older people. And we will discuss why that might be in another video.